I'm driving to Cape Town to the Nigerian offices to get my visa sorted out, and I got an interesting communication yesterday from Jet in New Zealand about the use of salt in the Karoo, and that got me thinking and us talking again about salt in South Africa and in Africa. And the issue of meat preservation in Nigeria came up again, and another issue that I've been looking at very closely recently is the use of blood in Africa and around the world, but Africa is the more contemporary example where some of these very old practices are still in place today. And I thought, since I take you along my route to Cape in Lagos to the factory, let me do a video here on the way to Cape Town. And we have the beautiful Table Mountain in the background there. It's just so good to be back. What a place. Initially when I started my interest in salt many years ago in South Africa, the issue, I wondered if Africans did not use salt in preservation. And there was he is a professor, Dr. Zander, and he told me that salt wasn't used as a condiment in South Africa or in Africa. In South Africa, I think his research focused on, and it wasn't used for preservation. And I tried to to look at the other side, because when I looked into antiquity, I saw that salt was so super important. I couldn't imagine that it was not important in Africa as well. And then over the years I discovered that there's huge salt resources. There's always been huge salt resources in Southern Africa. It was never a salt poor area. There were certain tribes, for sure, about one in the Botswana area, where people were depleted, salt depleted, especially the poorer people who only ate plants. And but salt was never a big thing in Africa, for sure not used for preservation. And after years of looking at this issue, I came to the realization that Dr. Zander is absolutely correct, spot on. In fact, I found this to be true across the continent, even in Nigeria. And interesting questions comes up then in terms of the massive salt trade of the Mali Empire and people and dynasties like that, empires like that. And what seems to have happened is that it was an industrial use of the salt, mainly for cattle. They would mix it into the water and feed the cattle every so often. Huge cattle country, and human consumption of salt was very low, and so the way that people got their salt was by the meat they consumed. The koi, what was referred to by the old people as the Hottentot, the koi is a good example of that. They didn't eat salt, and in fact they refer to the Europeans as people who eat salt, salted meat. And there's lovely stories about if they eat too much of the salted meat, how sick they got. They got ample salt from the animals that they would digest. And in across Nigeria, there's a very strong culture of consuming blood. There was historically NAFDAC, their regulator, food regulator. They through the United Nations for years now have been trying to persuade Nigerians not to consume the blood themselves. But a lot of the people remember as children, their parents would cook up the blood into a spongy-like consistency, and then it would be a delicacy that they will consume. And of course, the blood is loaded with proteins and things like iron, and salt. And in northern Kenya, in Ethiopia, in South Sudan, there's examples of tribes in South Sudan. There's tribes to this day who practice this, where they will puncture one of the veins of the animal in the neck, and they will let the blood out, and they will mix it with milk. And only 300 milliliters of this drink will give you more than enough to get to the modern day estimate of what our dietary intake of salt should be per day. Because of course salt is essential for humans. We can't live without it, but we have so much salt in our diets these days that it becomes a problem, that it is a problem. So the ancient African had got their salt from the meat they ate, and from the blood they drank, and from the milk. That was the sources of dietary salt. The biggest complaint I have in Nigeria when I make sausages there is that I use too much salt. I gave just the example of because the question then comes out, how did Africans preserve their meat? And I found this unique preservation system, very specific, deliberate preservation system, which I dealt with extensively previously. But let me tell the story again, where the animals are slaughtered on a slab. When I say slab, I mean a slab, as in slab of tiles on the floor. So there's a slab that's laid down on the floor, and the animal is slaughtered on that slab. It's not hoisted up into the air, and it's slaughtered on its skin. And then there's this practice which I think goes back into antiquity, where they will then put blood on the slaughtered carcass again, which is on the skin now, lying on the skin. And I think the reason why they did that was because of feeding the bacteria, because of the membranes, the blood very quickly run down again. And it is not true, as many people at the abattoirs tell me, that this is done to give the meat an appearance of freshness. It's not true at all, because it runs away, it runs down. There's, at the end of the day, when the meat's sold, there's no blood on the meat, or extremely little.
In 300 meters. Keep right at the fork.
That's my navigation to Cape Town. I get lost so quickly. I don't drive without it. So in any case,
keep right at the fork.
The bacteria, they use bacterial preservation, and this has been done in West
3
Africa.
kilometers. Take the exit on the left.
And I'm not. I think this may have been practiced across Africa. But of course in Nigeria there's these beautiful modern day examples, and there's veterinarians who studied this and who found at the abattoirs very little example of pathogens. Very little pathogens in the meat. In fact, the pathogens only start appearing many days later at the different markets. And it's also not these massive amounts of pathogens that one would expect, because the reason why that works is because Lock 7 or Lock 8, agricultural economist, a chemist told me, is what is required to keep pathogens out of a colony of healthy bacteria. So if the colony of healthy bacteria is sufficiently large, it will keep the pathogens away. And that's exactly the method of preservation in Nigeria. Is they use the skin bacteria, which are predominantly healthy, the healthy bacteria, Staphylococcus aureus and clonosis, and so on and so forth. That's very healthy. So that's the method of preservation, and it's an extremely effective method of preservation. When I remember in 2018, when I started going to Nigeria, I was absolutely appalled at how meat's being handled there. And then as I kept going back, I started asking the question, but why is the meat not going bad? And why are there not more people getting sick? And then I started really looking into this thing, and what appalled me turned into amazement. and then wonder. And then I really started to discover so much more about this and about the meat sharing and meat eating practices. And so that relates to the bacteria. Now they longer term preservation, of course, they did through drying. Again, there was no salt was not being used. They would the two ways that they would do that is to rub groundnut cake, which is the cake which is left after the oil has been extracted. They would rub that on the meat. And oil has been extracted in Nigeria for millennia. It is the hub, the center, the origin of the palm oil industry. So palm cakes were very, of course, very familiar to them. And then the Portuguese in the 1300s introduced peanuts, and they started what they refer to as groundnut industry, and extracting the oil. And then the cake, what is left, will be rubbed on the meat. So that will be dietary fibers then, we will call it today. So those fibers will aid in drying it in very humid conditions, as in Lagos. But also in the north, it will aid in the drying process. Notice that salt is not used for this. Now they will put some spices on, but not in the not the way developed in Europe, I must say. The salt culture, which I then realized very recently, came from the Celtic background, from the Hallstatt culture in Austria, and the culture in Salzburg in Austria, and through the spread of the Celtic culture, this spread across Europe, and Europe became from the salt mines. The technology was developed to cure pork with salt. And Europeans became people who predominantly use salt as preservation. And it was not the case in Africa. We went a far more productive, a far healthier way with this, in using the cake that is left after oil has been extracted. And then two things can happen with that. Either a spice for example, suya can be rubbed on, suya spice can be added, or if it's fried, it can be fried over the fire immediately. What they would do is they will rub the groundnut meal onto the meat, and they can dry it in the sun and in the wind, or they can fry it over the fire. Or they can take the meat. Another method of preservation would be to boil it and then deep fry it, and that will add another 5 days or so to your meat shelf life. So it's fascinating that it did not rely on salt. Now here in the Cape area in South Africa, with the Khoi people, there was an example of preservation, and that is when they caught locusts. They would spread them out on some cover to dry in the sun, and they would rub them with salt to preserve them. And there's another sign that I have, that an indication that it is not that. So salt preservation was not unknown to them. They just chose not to use it. And there's the story about the locust, but then even there's a burial practice of the Khoi people, that they would bury the deceased in the rug that he slept on, or his rug, and then they would put a little bit of salt with his tummy, on his tummy, and he will be buried like that. And I was wondering if that is not a sign, some symbolism behind that is connected with preservation. Of course, the Livingstone's body, when he passed away, was and he also described that salt in the diet, apart from what was obtained from animals, salt that's naturally present in the muscles of animals, the salt deficiency will come from a lack of eating meat, in other words. So that was the primary way that Africans got salt. And when Livingstone passed away, his body was covered in salt to preserve it. So it is not that the preserving power of salt was unknown to the African. The African knew about that, but chose not to use it. How exaggerated it is, there's probably some measure of inaccuracy involved but there's accounts of the Khoi people at the Cape that generally reached very old age. They became very old. Some of the authors claim that they regularly became more over 100 years old, and there's the two obvious things in their diet that is powerful, and that is no salt and no alcohol. Of course, very little alcohol. They made mead, honey, wine, but that was not the everyday thing. So but as far as preservation is concerned, there was bacterial preservation, and where, yes, there was in the Karoo region, there's massive salt pans in the Karoo. Salt was not a problem, and there's the salt bush that the sheep ate. There's modern, in the 20s and 30s, there's agricultural researchers in South Africa who writes about that. But I have no example of native people burning those salt bush for salt. I thought I found a reference to this in Limpopo, when also a very old man told us about the tradition from his grandfather and great-grandfather, where they would roll the meat in ash before they would hang it in the tree. But what I discovered is that was done for two reasons. One is to keep the flies away, and the second was for taste. The Nama people in Namibia, there's a land surveyor who sent me this beautiful story, also an Earthworm Express reader. He sent me this beautiful story about how he one day couldn't get back to camp or something like that quick enough, and the native people who was with him, they started a fire, and they would roll their meat in ash, and the amazing taste that added, the flavor that added to the meat was unbelievable. And so what I realized is that even though if it is the right type of ash that it is rolled in, it will aid, there will be salt there, but not nearly to the extent, and I don't to the extent that Europeans used it, and it was not a common practice. It was a masking agent. That's why I think taste was more important. In some of these writings from old travelers in southern Africa, they would say that if the salt if the meat was had a little bit of a putrid taste after it was dried, the ancestors to South African biltong, they would roll it in the ash to mask the off flavors. Isn't that interesting? So it seems as if the use of this of the ash even was more for the sake of taste. And then of course, yep, from New Zealand, I've done a lot of work there, and a similar thing there, that the Maoris knew about salt, but they chose not to use it for health reasons. So they knew the mussels and stuff that they collect from the sea to eat, they had to soak it in fresh water to draw out the salt, otherwise you'll get sick if you eat too many of them. And that's what they did. And but there's no example of salt production in there was no old salt production done in New Zealand, even though the Polynesians knew about salt. I did a paper on this and showed from Taiwan the huge and impressive salt works. Salt was very much part of the culture of Taiwan and of China, and as it was in Europe. And so you have these examples of salt cured meat from China and from Europe. And in Europe it became Europe. When I say Europe, I include England, and then that was exported obviously to the Americas through the Europeans, and salt became a thing in Chile and in Peru. And I'm not too clued up with the North American Indians. There was definitely from the little bit that I read, there was also use of salt there, but to what extent it was, I'm not sure. So that's my interesting discussion this morning as I'm driving. I'm here in Cape Town. I'm going to start focusing, finding parking, and then go and sort my visa issues out. Salt preservation, South Africa, Europe, the tradition of using salt, fascinating stuff.